Well, thanks for being here in Frisco. How many of you are here for either a short time or a long part of the summer? Good, good. Smart move. Yeah. So I am a history professor. I'm also a tour guide. I've done every kind of tour you can imagine. I do canoes, I do rafts, I do bus coaches. Once upon a time I did private trains and private jets, pre 9/11. So if you're interested in tours, I work with a tour company out of Denver and we do interesting tours. We just did a week in Seattle and Victoria in Canada. And that's a lot of fun. They're small. I think we only had 8 people on that. We had 28. We did the Upper Rio Grande. Started in Denver, drove to Creede, and then followed the Rio Grande River all the way through New Mexico. So happy to chat with somebody after the talk about that. As an author, I've written a number of books. The 2 that I have for sale today, one is on Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. That's a new, fairly contentious national monument. It's been designated and shrunk and redesignated, and hopefully it'll stay intact. It's gigantic. It's 1.35 million acres, and just a fabulous place that has, I call it the 21st century Mesa Verde because of what you can find and how accessible it is. Today's talk and the other book that I have available for sale is on the Woolly West. And the complete title is The Woolly West, Colorado's Hidden History of Sheepscapes. And this book won the Colorado Book Award, and it also won the Best Book of the Year for a nonfiction book, the Wrangler Western Heritage Award from the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. And when I got that email, I thought it was a joke, you know. Why would the Cowboy Museum be interested in sheep and sheep herders? But we won, and it was on live TV, and I was introduced by Will Rogers' granddaughter, who'd married into a big Basque sheep-owning family in California, and John Wayne's son. Well, John Wayne's son had started drinking a little before 5 o'clock, and he's trying to introduce me in the book, and he can't say sheepscapes. And it's, you know, because he's trying to read the title of the book, and he just can't get sheepscapes out there. So that was fun. I had a minute to talk on this live TV program, and it wasn't fair because Kevin Costner had an hour and a half. And, you know, just can't win. But what interested me about sheep is everybody writes about cowboys. Everybody writes about cattle. And no one had done a serious book on sheep and sheep herders in about 70 years. And even though this mainly focuses on Colorado, it also has sheep coming into Colorado from Wyoming, coming into Colorado from Utah, and then herders coming up into Colorado from New Mexico. So it was a lot of fun. I wanted to originally do just photographs of sheep herder aspen art, or what are called arbor glyphs. And I'll be showing you some of those photographs here a little later. And my wife said, no, that's too simple. So I jumped in, and no one had ever chronicled the wars, the cattle and sheep wars in the state of Colorado. And even though I'm sure somebody could come along and do a different version, at least I got a really good start trying to figure that out. So I'll talk about that. So here we are in Frisco with, you know, Vail up the road, and all of this is new. There was mining, but basically before I-70 is completed through the middle of Colorado, this is a pretty remote place. And yet there were sheep here, specifically at the base of what is now Copper Mountain as well as Vale. And I'll tell that story too. So I want to begin a really great sort of late children, early adolescent book is called And Now Miguel. So this is from that book. In our family, there is always one thing, and that is the sheep. The summer passes and the winter comes, and soon it is Easter and the time for spring. But all the time, no matter when, there is the sheep. Everything comes and goes except one thing, the sheep. For that is the work of our family, to raise sheep. And then from Aldo Leopold, there are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. And I was honored to be able to finish this book in Aldo Leopold's cabin. He built a bungalow for his wife on the Carson National Forest at Tres Piedras, New Mexico. And they have a writer-in-residence program, and I got to go there with a couple of my dogs and write. And I was really inspired by Aldo Leopold in that building. So there's plenty of books on mining, on Native Americans, but no recent books on sheep and sheep herders. So this is, in a way, ongoing research. As I talk today, I hope I don't do too badly. But I've got a lot I want to communicate. Of the hundreds of books written about cowboys and cowboying in the American West, there are few volumes on sheep and sheepmen. Cowboys sing to their cows and ride the long circle each night around their herd, but then return to their bedroll and a sidekick takes over. Not so with sheep. A lone shepherd would be in charge of a band of maybe 1,000 sheep, and though he may have a horse, it's really his dogs that kept the sheep in line, bedded them down, guarded them through the night, and against coyotes and bears and wolves. In the herding tradition, the morning star is the shepherd's star, La Estrella del Pastor, because herders rise in the dark. Before sunrise, the flock nibbles away, bunched up, moving always toward water and grass, the two elements essential to sheep grazing described in pioneer diaries and journals. Cowboys get the fancy hats and the hand-tooled leather boots. Shepherds wear whatever they can find and carry a staff or crook to catch errant sheep by a rear hoof. It's an ancient practice, far older than 19th century cowboying and trailing cattle north to railroad terminal points as America moved west. Sheep herding stories abound in the Bible and in diverse cultures worldwide. But I wanted to learn about sheep in Colorado, where they came from, how they arrived, who owned them, who herded them, and what impact they had on the environment for more than a century. Cowboys rode the range together, or at least in pairs. Sheep herders were always alone. And I think that is one of the reasons I wanted to research this book. That and their dogs. I mean, I love their dogs. Right now I've got a half lab, 25% Great Pyrenees, and then 25% general herding dog. And that dog is smarter than I am. That dog is a lot of fun. I can be gone all day on trails, and when it's time to go back to the truck, she remembers each turn. I can go to the bank, and if I try and go in a door that I didn't go in the last time, she'll stop and look at me like you're going in the wrong door. I mean, so when you think about lonely sheep herders, they're in charge of, maybe 1,000 sheep. They've got a couple of dogs and a horse, and that's all. So part of what I discovered in doing this research was who the ethnic groups were and where they were. And it turned out there were, sort of four main groups. A lot of Scotch in the South Park area, Fair Play. Greeks north of I-70 and on this interstate corridor, and then Basques sort of from Grand Junction south down towards Telluride. So finding those families and talking to them and getting their photographs and learning what they did in the sheep industry was really just a whole lot of fun. Sheep herders are alone. Maybe once every couple weeks, the camp tender arrives. He brings tobacco, maybe a skin of wine, more bullets, fresh peaches, news from home. Quote, "It is his ingenuity and resourcefulness, born of isolation and sharpened by experience, that distinguishes the herder from the cowboy. The hired hand takes his morning orders from the boss, mounts his bronc, and rides off," state Charles Town and Edward Wentworth. Quote, "The herder, given a bunch of sheep, is sent away to remain for months in remote mountain areas hard to reach. Here it is up to him to work out his own and the flock's salvation." So it was fascinating trying to figure out how that worked and what you were afraid of and what the dangers were. And the dangers were real. Lightning, fall on a horse, break your leg. You can't set your own broken leg. And there's no cell phones, there's no communication. You had to be reliant. Some of these New Mexican herders got really good at identifying plants and herbs that they could use for healing, and that they'd actually bring some of that back out of the high country into the valleys when they turned the sheep around. And they turned the sheep around about, I'd say August 5th, August 10th. The sheep in the high country would then go back into the valleys, particularly the San Luis Valley. This book began in an aspen grove as I studied carvings left by dozens of herders over decades. Some of the herders carved their initials each year as they returned to the same grove. Quote, "The tender, fluttered sisterhood of quaking asp," wrote Mary Austin. "As I contemplated the carvings and thought of the baaing, blatting sheep moving through the smooth-barked aspen, I wondered, why were sheep hated? What was that deep-seated animosity against white, woolly creatures?" And we had some folks come in. Can we get some chairs for them? When I show pictures, they're going to need to be sitting up a little higher. Why did cowboys prosper in poetry, folk songs, and myth as rugged individuals, while sheep herders who truly worked alone are all but forgotten in the annals of the American West? Or when they are remembered, they are despised. So I had to learn about some laws and their importance. The Timber Reserve Act, 1891, an amazing law passed by Congress to allow the President of the United States to set aside from the public domain timber, which began as forest reserves and then, under my hero Teddy Roosevelt, became national forests in 1905. And Theodore Roosevelt is responsible for every single acre of national forest totally surrounding us here in Frisco and throughout the whole state. He did that all between 1901 and 1909 and had a lot of fun doing it. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 is the law that will finally end this cattle and sheep wars, because the real conflict wasn't in the summer. Sheep can go very high. Sheep can go to 12,000 feet. Cattle won't do that. Cattle, you're lucky to have them graze at 8,000 feet. So the real problem was winter, because stockmen needed to get their animals out of the snow. So in the winter, lower elevation than where we are here at 9,000 feet, you've got sheep and cattle competing for the same grass on lower level, what we would now call Bureau of Land Management land. And that's where the conflicts really escalated, was cattle and sheep trying to be in the same place at the same time, and it didn't work. So no trouble in the summer because the sheep were higher than the cattle. So I'll talk about that. The Taylor Grazing Act, the Bureau of Land Management is created in 1946. which covers this other land that was not included in the Forest Service. And then we've got the Wilderness Act, 1964. We have wilderness areas all around us here in this part of Colorado, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Colorado remains the third largest wool producing state, which is a little hard to imagine. And Colorado lamb is known everywhere, and yet Americans don't eat lamb. The high point for beef was about 1976. Now we eat more chicken and pork. But lamb, we eat less than a pound of lamb a person in the United States. And the ramifications of that are really interesting. And it took, in doing this research, talking to all these families, trying to figure out where the market is for their lamb, and that answer was a real surprise when I figured it out. So, learning Basque, Greek, and about Hispanic families, this lonely legacy of herders in the high country, the pioneer families that succeeded because of pluck, perseverance, a willingness to risk rain, snow, coyotes, and cold nights alone, all in an attempt to raise lambs, put weight on the wethers, the yearling sheep, and make an income twice yearly from wool and from meat. And that's one of the secrets that I finally figured out. A range-raised steer in 1890, what the cowboys were chasing around, takes 3 years to get to market. 3 years to put enough weight on a steer to be able to ship it to Chicago. Meanwhile, the sheepman has had 6 paychecks because he's had a lamb crop each year plus a wool crop. So these very families that were, ridiculed and looked down on and had low social status were making a lot of money. And then they started to buy banks. And once they bought banks, then they bought their neighboring cattlemen when the banks foreclosed on the cattlemen. So that was one of the secrets. And it wasn't easy, but there was a lot more money in sheep and wool and lambs than in cattle. Cattle had a higher status, but the money was in sheep. And in fact, Frisco, 1859, 1860, as the mountains start to develop with mining, sheep get here a lot faster than cattle. So that's what the miners ate. That's what the prospectors ate, because you could get sheep into these tight little mountain valleys. The only money that Kit Carson ever really made, he was a great guy, did all sorts of things in the West, but the only money he ever really made was when he took a flock of sheep from New Mexico to California for the California Gold Rush. And he brought them up through the Weminuche Wilderness in Colorado. A rico is a Spanish word for rich, or a rich family. And 2 families in New Mexico figured out, whoa, there's a California gold rush. Those folks are going to need something to eat. And they bought sheep in New Mexico for about $1, $1.50 each. 3 months later, they delivered them in Sacramento for $12 each. That's how much money you could make. Now, in the process, they're going to destroy a lot of grass and wetlands and river areas in New Mexico that are never going to come back because they had too many sheep in the same place at the same time for too long. But folks made money. So trying to figure this all out was pretty interesting because, it's a complicated part of the American West. Colorado alone has 15 named sheep creeks and 19 peaks christened Sheep Mountain. Now, whether that means, bighorn sheep or domestic sheep, I'm not sure, but those are our names. And yet John Muir, who herded sheep for a while in the Sierras, called them, quote, hoofed locusts. And it's true that sheep can decimate a meadow, because the one thing different between a sheep and a cow, their jaw. So a cow can come along and clip grass, but a sheep can actually open its mouth more like a drag line and get down and pull the grass up by the roots. Now, you can get damage from cattle if you leave them in the same place too long. And the same with sheep. But sheep, because of the way their jaw works, can do a lot of quick damage. And that's why the cattlemen really, really hated them. But there was money to be made. And one of the things that helped were these little trains. So the narrow gauge trains that came through different parts of Colorado, you could put sheep on box cars, and the sheep would go spend the winter out in Canyonlands over by Moab, and then you could put them on these little trains and take them all the way to Aspen. So fascinating. The Basques had no interest whatsoever in becoming Americans. They were here, they were going to make money, they were going to go back to France or Spain. The Greeks were here to make money. World War I is going to change all that. Now you can't go home. And then what really changes it is the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, because now you just can't put your animals out there anywhere you want. You have to have what's legally called commensurability. If you've got 1,000 sheep and you're putting them up in the high mountain meadows, you have to have private property enough to take them off public land, out of the forest, and put them on private property. When Congress passes that law in 1934, all of a sudden the sheepmen have to totally change their way of operations. It's 1934, the Depression's on, everybody's broke. The sheepmen want high altitude grass. They don't want, mines. They're not interested in gold or silver. They're just interested in grass. There's plenty of foreclosed homesteads, so they get bought to put their sheep on. Well, if those families kept that land, and some of them did, and you waited until the 1970s and the 1980s, and all of a sudden, somebody wants to put a ski area there, and you happen to own the only private property at the base of the mountain, that gets interesting. And the Juflis family, Greek family, ran sheep in Vail Valley and owned basically the Vail Valley. And when the guys come along, the old Camp Hale guys come along and they say, hey, we want to put a ski area here at Vail. And they bump into Mr. Juflis herding sheep. And he takes a look at them and he looks, they look at him and they're all well dressed and he's in his jeans. And they say, we're going to put a ski area here. And Mr. Juflis says, oh, well, good luck with that, and moves off with his sheep. And they did. But they put the base of the first lift at Vail on his private property. The surveyor got it wrong. So they figured it out and sent him a check. He tore it into little pieces and mailed it back. They sent him a bigger check. He tore it into little pieces and mailed it back. Then they went looking for him with a checkbook and a bottle of ouzo. And that was the first sale of private property in the Vail Valley to Vail Associates. So this history of sheep is a lot more interesting and a lot more complicated than what I ever imagined. And the immigrant part of it is so exciting because these immigrants worked and worked and worked, and sometimes they lost everything and had to start over again. That same year, 1934, there was a huge blizzard that came out of Canada, rolls down through the Rockies, and it's April. All those sheepmen had just lambed, and they just sheared those sheep. They're going to freeze to death. And there's nothing they can do. And the herders are trying to build fires and bring the lambs to the fires, and it's horrible. And one guy had spent basically his adult life buying sheep, paying them off. He was finally solvent, and he loses everything in that 4-day blizzard and has to start over again. But they did. And it was a time in American history when immigrants could work really hard and succeed. So for the Greeks, how the Greeks get here, they wound up in coal mines in Utah. And those were too dangerous. So they got Mormon sheepmen to let them run some flocks. And the really hard-working sheepmen, Basque or Greek, didn't get paid, wouldn't take their wages. They took it in lambs. They started their own flocks, which meant they had to find some other piece of grass to put them on. And that's the history of Colorado for the northwest corner, the southwest corner, and in some cases, right here in the central Rockies, was where else could people put sheep? Paul Laxalt, a Basque descendant from a very famous Nevada family, writes, quote, "The sons of old country people everywhere must fight a little harder and do something better with their lives. Because we were born of old country people in a new land, and right or wrong, we had not felt equal to those around us, and we had to do a little more than they did in everything we did." Or from David Lavender's book, One Man's West, quote, "The day of the free or open range is forever gone, and in spite of occasional bunkhouse fumings over bits of local injustice, there is not a rancher who would willingly return to the former catch-as-catch-can ways of obtaining grass." And John J. Ingalls, whose sister would write the Little House on the Prairie books, became a Kansas U.S. senator, wrote, "Grass invades the solitude of deserts, climbs the inaccessible slopes and pinnacles of mountains, and modifies the history, character, and destiny of nations." So, we don't think about this. The Greeks were pretty funny because, as I said, everybody finally stays because they can't go home during World War I. And whether you're Basque or whether you're Greek, you got to go back to your village to find a wife. So you start this formal letter writing process. Were there girlfriends you remembered? Who's available? And every one of them then would get a wife from the old country and bring them to, Craig, Colorado, or Frisco, and bam, the work began. So I was fascinated when I found up near Craig a family where that had happened. Older sheepman, younger wife, had kids, Great Depression hit, husband dies, she can't afford to run things, sells the sheep, but never the land. The Depression's over, she's ready to start again. She goes back to Greece for a husband. How cool was that? And starts a whole separate family, and those two families dominate a lot of northwest Colorado. One's into cattle, one's into sheep. The sheep herding animosity was so deep that it gives us an entirely new Colorado county. The cattlemen in in Steamboat Springs were so upset with the sheepmen, they basically said, go start your own county. And they split Routt County and created Moffat County and Craig over issues with sheep. So just tracking all this stuff down was pretty fascinating. Our herders, a lot of them came out of northern New Mexico. And that's different because they can always go home. So the Basques and the Greeks have to make this decision. Do we become Americans? And they did. But how they did it was differently. So for the Basques, you'd get on a boat, you'd come to New York, you'd wind up on the train, you'd wind up in Grand Junction, and just like Elko, Nevada, and Boise, Idaho, there were Basque hotels. And in those hotels, you would get the red wine you wanted, you could get the food you wanted, and you could wait around and see who needed a herder. Or if you were injured, that's where you went to recover. And one of the stories about those Basque hotels is how the sheep herders got things mixed up. That when they were lonely and alone and they were with their sheep in the high mountains, all they wanted to talk about was women. And when they finally got to town and they're in the Basque hotels, all they want to talk about is their sheep. So just tracking these stories down, and it's such an amazing part of Colorado and then the history of the West. The animosity against sheep in the 1930s, everybody's broke. We have federal programs, and one of those programs is for art. And the Works Progress Administration will hire artists who will come and do murals. And they'll do a mural over the entrance to the post office on the inside and all sorts of things. And in Rifle, Colorado, down the road, here comes this artist, and he's painting the little mountain scenes, and he's got water and mountains and a couple of cows, and he paints some sheep. And the cattlemen come into the postmaster and they say, those sheep better be gone by tomorrow morning, or we're not coming back into this post office. So the artist had to put in more cows. In Walsenburg, a sheepman is overextended, bank calls the note, and the sheep guy says, I can't pay you, the market has collapsed. Nobody's buying lamb or wool. It's the Depression. The banker says, I don't care. Your note's due. Pay up. Friday morning, pay up. Sheepman says, okay. Dawn that morning in Walsenburg, you can hear the little bells. He brings in 1,000 sheep and surrounds the bank. Says, here, they're yours, take them. You wanted them, here they are. They negotiated a new loan. So it was just really fun trying to figure these out. And I came up with this new word, sheepscape. So I took two words, sheep herder and landscape, and I combined them into sheepscape. So what is a sheepscape? And those of you who like to hike, this is interesting stuff. So a sheepscape can be a carved aspen tree. It can be a bit of a stone corral in a canyon where maybe they needed to keep the lambs out of the wind. It can be a cross where a sheep herder maybe got hit by lightning. There are sheep herder references on Forest Service maps if you know where to look. And so up by, sort of by Steamboat, up in that direction, on one of the White River National Forest maps, there's a a place called, on the map, Dead Mexican Spring. I thought, what is this? And I did my research, and it turned out a sheep herder had gone into town, done really well, playing poker, went back to tend his sheep, and the cowboys who lost all their money followed him back, killed him, took their money back. So it's on the map as Dead Mexican Spring. Yeah. So sheepscapes, obviously, stock driveways, and that's the secret. And there is no definitive map of Colorado stock driveways. But remember I said sheep can go higher than cattle, but you don't want them in the same place at the same time. So the Forest Service designates a driveway where keep the cattle out of the way, and the sheep can go on up from, say, 5,000 or 6,000 feet up to 9,000 to 10,000 or even higher. So when you find those, you're inevitably going to find sheep herder carvings, because that's how they move the sheep both into the high country and then back out. Wooden corrals, sometimes lambing pens, V-shaped wooden bear traps. Bears were far more damaging to sheep than to cattle, and sometimes you can find these old bear traps. And I was interviewing a fellow in New Mexico, and he said his grandfather was herding sheep up in the South San Juan's wilderness. It's the last Colorado wilderness before you hit the New Mexican border south of Pagosa Springs. And this bear had been trapped in there, and his grandfather was teasing the bear. Not a bright thing to do. Finally shoots the bear, goes to get it out of the trap, and realizes the only thing left keeping that bear in the trap was one tendon on one foot. That bear was about to spring out of the trap and kill him. So yeah, not a good idea. But the bear traps are there if you know where to look. Cairns. Not hikers' cairns, but sheep herder cairns. And I'll show you pictures of that. Sometimes blinds to get out of the wind, or if there's a snowstorm. Sometimes cans that you can find where left over from an old camp. Trenches, stone enclosures. If you've got Navajo herders, and there were a few, they built sweat lodges high up. Lunate hearths. So luna from moon, moon-shaped hearth. Wouldn't take much wood, but a really small little protective area of stones if a herder's trying to keep warm. So those are all examples. So the New Mexican tradition was different because unlike the Greeks or the Basques, they could go home. So they did. And so if you're from a poor village, and most of the northern New Mexican villages were pretty poor by the 1930s, the only way to make money was to follow the sheep. That was the phrase. And then when you were paid in cash, you brought that cash back to your mother, you brought that cash back to your wife. And in these remote New Mexican villages, what did those women buy first with that cash? Big wood cook stoves. Cook stoves. So instead of having the little, New Mexican hornos, the little stoves in the corner of the room, they bought these big metal cook stoves. Just fascinating. As early as 1880, 3/4 of New Mexico sheep grazed under the ownership of only 20 families. So there was no opportunity except to come north into Colorado. Sheep camp hospitality. If you've got a tent, platform tent, and you've set it up high, the inside of that tent has not changed in 100 years. Bed on a cot in the back, stove as you enter on the left, horse gear, beans, and then the problem. Dog food. which bears love to eat. So you got a little stove going, you're making your mutton stew for dinner, you're way out with the sheep, and the bear comes looking for that dog food. And so pretty interesting, how to deal with things. And in folklore, there's even something called tin dogs. Tin dogs were the cans that both cowboys and sheep herders was canned milk with their coffee. And you're talking about coffee strong enough to, float a horseshoe. They liked milk. So then they would take those cans and they'd run a hole through the cans, put them on a solid piece of wire, and rattle it like a tambourine to get the sheep to move, or to get the sheep to move in a certain direction. And I've only seen a couple of those. That's a really rare antique to find. But the food, oh my goodness. They had roots and herbs they used, and although, they were allowed to, take an old ewe, it's amazing for these remote sheep herders how many young lambs broke a leg and that young lamb wound up in the pot instead of the old ewe. Because lamb tastes a whole lot better than aged mutton. So what's going to happen? World War II. My dad was in the Pacific. He was a major in the Marines. And all the Australians did was take all the oldest, most worthless sheep they could find and sell it to the Marines and the Army. And my dad would not let my mother cook lamb at all, ever, never. And then we switched from wool. We wear, cotton and nylons and synthetics, and so the whole market has changed. And there will be less sheep in the high country. And now in Colorado, it's really complicated because we voted to introduce wolves, and the sheep guys are going to get more aggressive dogs. And who's in the high country? All those mountain bikers, all those hikers, all those backpackers. And try and explain a mountain bike to a 150-pound Turkish Akbash dog who knows how to protect sheep. So right here in Vail, we had a situation where the Forest Service flubbed up and they took a sheep herder's grazing allotment and they allowed for a mountain bike race in the same place at the same time. And one female mountain biker got attacked by two guardian dogs. 97 stitches later, lost her eye. Went to court in Eagle County, lost, went forward on appeal, and the sheep man's insurance company blinked and said, all right. And that was the first $1 million payment for bad sheepdogs. That's before wolves. So it's tough, and it's getting tougher. And I think there will continue to be sheep on public land, but north of us, north of I-70, way up in those counties where there's fewer, much less recreation pressure than there is down here. So I'm going to tell one sheep herder joke story, and then we're going to see images. And this took place in Eagle County long before the interstate, when the only way to get through was on Highway 6. And in those days, if you had a 1950s Cadillac, pretty big car, you didn't pump gas. Somebody would run out of the gas station and clean your windshield and check your oil and fill your tank. So this sheep guy shows up, brand new burgundy Cadillac, and the gas station attendant is cleaning the car, and he notices there's two lambs in the back seat chewing up the brand new leather interior. And he says to the driver, the sheep man, he says, you've got lambs in the back that are eating your car. And it's a new car. And the sheep guy says, well, why not? They paid for it. And I know that story's true because I've heard so many different versions with different kinds of cars, Cadillacs, Packards, Buicks. All right, we're going to tune this up. So it's just been a lot of fun doing this research, writing this book, and guess what I finally learned about the lamb market? All these sheep men, and a lot of them are pretty, politically conservative. Guess where their market is for lamb? If most Americans eat less than a pound a year, and they've got fresh lamb, who's eating it?
New Zealand.
All the immigrants who are Muslim in Denver, Phoenix, Buffalo. The market for these sheep guys' lamb are immigrants for whom, you could have a goat for your daughter's wedding, but lamb is far better. And when I give these talks, it's amazing who comes up to me and wants to tell stories. And I've heard lots of stories. One of them was, we ran sheep until we paid off the cattle, and then we kept the cattle. But I had a guy come up to me who was a trucker, and I kept seeing this black hat in the back of the audience. Finally, he comes up and says, every month I load up a truck full of ewes and I take them to Phoenix, and that's where the market is for lamb and mutton. Who would have thought? So this is an example of a sheepscape. It's an arbor glyph. It's carved on an aspen tree in a route which was part of this direct way to get to the high country. Remember, these are lonely sheep herders, and so there are different erotic images. There are also pornographic images, which I will not be showing, but they're out there. And it's funny because sometimes I stumble across these groves, these carved aspen trees, these galleries where men were communicating to each other, and somebody puts a ATV route right through the middle of one of these, and there's some pretty racy aspen trees. And I'm wondering, did somebody actually look at the trees when they planned this ATV route? This is fascinating. These are from Southwest Colorado. She's almost like a Greek satyr of some sort. I'm not sure what the point was with this one. This is fascinating. I don't know if the sheep herder has a stomach ache, or he's trying to use sympathetic magic and he wants his boss to have a stomach ache, so he carved his boss. Hard to say. Cairns. The really good cairns are Basque. And in Basque, the word translates into stone boy. And some of these are so big, the only way to finish them had to be on horseback, because they're up, they're almost 8 feet. And these are magnificent. You can find them all around the Sierras in California, here in parts of Colorado. This is right on the Weminuche Wilderness boundary. And I had a little research funding. I went up into Wyoming to do some of my research, and I found this fabulous 1930s oral history interview of a New Mexican herder who had herded in Wyoming. And he talked about a spring blizzard he wasn't prepared for, and he can't see. He's literally ground blizzard, he can't see. He's lost, he's trying to get back to, they had a cabin, he's trying to get back. He stumbles into one of these cairns, feels the top of it, knows which cairn that is, knows where that cairn was, knows the direction from the cairn to the cabin, walks in that direction and is saved. And he says, I'm alive, because of these cairns, and I only lost 2 fingers to frostbite. So they did have a purpose other than, just their aesthetic value. This is fun. This is definitely sort of movie style. And this was up by Steamboat Springs. It's gone. The photographer that took this picture, we went back up trying to find it, and it's gone. Aspen trees fall over. Aspen trees live at the most 100 years. The golden age for arbor glyphs is about 1930 to 1970. And then the New Mexican herders quit coming north. So now the herders are Peruvian. They're from parts of South America. They don't have the same traditions. So these are going to collapse. And this is a part of Colorado history that's so important. Some of the herders were penitentes, which is a northern New Mexican, very devout Catholic group. And other herders came from Spain, Española, because in the 1950s, the idea was really good Basque herders are from Spain or France. And so while everybody else is trying to come to America with Europe demolished after World War II, it's the Basques who are allowed to get in more easily. Look at this. That is a Celtic cross. That cross symbol is 1,000 years old. And here it is carved on an aspen tree. Now, does that guy have a good-looking mustache or what? I wish I could grow a mustache like that. So, I don't know, is this a self-portrait? Is this, somebody's friend? And the handwriting. Many of these herders, got to the 8th grade and that was it. Here it is, July 24th, and 1934, and he's showing off that he learned script. He learned the Palmer method in a one-room school in northern New Mexico. And it says where he's from, Chama. So I love looking for arbor glyphs. I love it in the fall because of the aspens and where to find the cairns. So fall will be coming, and try and figure out where the sheep might have been in your part of Colorado. This is fabulous. The very, very best carvers used only the prick of a horseshoe nail, the tiny edge of a knife, because they knew that as the tree grew, that scratch would get bigger. They never gouged the tree. They never hurt the aspen. This is a Navajo carver. It's really faint, but this is a dancer from the night chant. It's a yay figure, and the night chant goes 9 nights. Look at it. I mean, you can see the bend in the legs. It's just gorgeous and so faint, I almost missed it. Kilroy was here. The herders wound up in World War II and they came back and they did Kilroy. So, and think about biological succession. When aspens start to fall, spruce and fir come in. So don't just look in the aspen trees, also look in the fir forest. And here in a fir forest, you can see how shaded it is. I found this fabulous image, which I presume is his mother. And he's carving this to honor his mother and the date. And I think that's 1941, July 1941. So it is so fun to get out there in the fall, look around. This guy loved to carve little cabins with smoke coming through the chimney. And at first, I thought he was dyslexic. Because instead of it saying Taos, New Mexico, it's Mexico Nuevo. And then I realized, no, he's not dyslexic. He's a Spanish speaker, and the noun comes before the adjective. I was the one who had it wrong. But I kept seeing this guy's little carved cabins. Picasso could not have done that better. Halandras, Gus, July 12th, 1975. Gus has now passed on the sheep business, and his great contribution to Colorado is he created the Meeker sheepdog trials. And if you want to have a lot of fun, it's like middle September. Go up there, there's plenty of lamb to eat, there's lots of old sheep wagons, and people come from all over, literally all over, all over North America to test their sheepdogs. So they bring these sheep out of the high country, out of the flat tops wilderness, and they've been out there for a while, and they're not, they're a little wild. And the dogs have to move the sheep, and the dogs cannot move the sheep without explicit commands from the herder, and those commands are whistles and hand gestures, and that's it. So it is this incredible dance of, and dog command. And I watched one really good big border collie, and this ewe was just obnoxious. This ewe was just obstinate. And the border collie didn't know what to do, and so ran in this direction, came back at full speed, ran right into that ewe and body blocked the ewe. Bam! And then the ewe woke up and went in the corral. But that wasn't in the rules. And everybody on the bleachers went, oh. They were sympathetic with the dog, but you can't smack the sheep. This is the V-Rock, the story of the bear in the trap. Happened somewhere in that wilderness. Cairns, these are between Delta and Grand Junction. Where, this is the winter range, pretty low elevation. This is one of the great stories from the book, was the Montoya family came to me and said, wanted to have lunch, and said, we know you're doing this research. We have a cross on a mountain, and it's aging and it's coming apart, and we don't know what to do. And I said, well, let me think about it. We can find a museum to put it in, and it has a carving on the top. And I realized that these penitente herders had to be with the sheep during the most important days of Easter. And they couldn't be at church, they couldn't be with their families. So they invented their own traditions. And in this case, they climbed this mountain on scree rock on their knees and barefoot as penance, as part of their sacrifice. And then they put this cross. So I said, well, maybe do a new cross. And they did. And I'll show you that in a minute. Here's another kind of a sheepscape where you've got paintings on a wall that was part of where lambs were. And this has dates. This is a penitente cross. It's in a shadow box. And we're going to end with this. This is the new cross. And I was never so honored as to be asked to help carry this up the mountain. And of course it's illegal. You can't put religious symbols on public land. But we didn't tell the Forest Service, and they didn't ask. And there it is. So this is not a dull archaeological site. This is an ongoing cultural site for multiple generations of this sheep herding family. So, thank you very much.